Hello, everybody. Welcome to Heart Mind Alchemy Lab. I am Holly Copeland, and I am here today with Sky Nelson's Isaacs. I am super excited for this interview. Welcome, Sky.
Thanks. Good to be here, Holly. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
You are so welcome, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. So I am so excited for the show we have today and this interview with Sky. I have been digging into his book, Leap into Wholeness, and digesting some of his other interviews. And I am so excited, Sky, about the intersection that you walk between science and spirituality. And the Heart Mind Alchemy Lab community in particular is, you know, people who are into this beautiful intersection of technology and consciousness and meditation and spirituality, all, you know, working to improve their lives and the lives of others. And there's, you know, the work of David Bohm, which, as I'm sure we will get into, I think your work so beautifully weaves from, or, you know, leaps off from, and others like him. What I absolutely so appreciate about what you're doing is helping people really take this work of physics and what we're finding in non-dual traditions, for example, that I study and practice, and actually understand the physics behind them. It's your stuff is mind-blowing to me. So I'm really excited to dive in.
Science is an exploration, it's a method. So I think there are some things that I can contribute that are practical and concrete in the scientific perspective, and they're always growing and evolving and being verified or disproven. So it is an open field. And I think that a lot of times we approach the scientific knowledge as if it's the knowledge itself that's valuable, but it's the process that's valuable, because all of our models are simply models. You know, what we understand an electron to be. Every physicist will agree, well, we actually don't know what an electron is. We know what properties it has under certain conditions. So we form a model about an electron or about a photon of light. So we think we know what it's like, and then we try to imagine it in other situations, and we use our old models in the new situations. So we use our models of, you know, light is like a wave where you pass it through two slits and it interferes on the screen in this double slit pattern. And so we form a model of that. And then we apply it in a different situation, what's called the photoelectric effect, and suddenly you find that our model breaks down because the particle of light strikes an electron in the metal, and that behaves like it's a particle, like it's a golf ball or something. So the models that we have are always limited to the situations that we're using them in. And it's true here too. I'm trying to develop a foundation based in our knowledge of science, of space and time, that allows for possibility of synchronicity. It's not necessarily going to convince everybody that synchronicity is a phenomenon that you need to take seriously in a scientific way or in a physics way, but that is the effort that I'm trying to make and put the pieces together. And there's enough unexplored territory in physics to do that kind of research, which is always great. When, you know, in your field, there's actually unexplored things that people sort of take for granted. And one of those things is time. And a synchronicity is falling together in time. Chron means time in Greek. This is one version of time. So time being this thing we don't really understand that well. And David Bohm being someone who studied quantum physics, his own model of quantum physics that had to do with wholeness, which we can talk more about. You know, there's two things really. There's time that we don't fully understand, and there's this notion of wholeness, which is, in my view, the opposite of reductionism. And most scientists will approach the world and say, the world is reductionist. You can break everything down into parts. Just like your pixels on your screen, you can break everything down into pixels, and you can understand what's on the screen based upon the parts. Holism is something that is greater than or different than just the parts themselves that emerges from it. So these are the two pieces that I bring together in a scientific way to try and understand better our world, and specifically synchronicity and wholeness.
Wonderful. And I really can't wait to dive in, because wholeness is something that I've experienced as a meditator, for example, like feeling that fundamental wholeness, and teaching and coaching from that place of wholeness, and how when you come to the world from that fundamental felt sense, right? It's not a conceptual idea of wholeness, actually. It's because I know you're a meditator and a spiritual practitioner yourself, right? So we experience wholeness, and we know without a doubt that it exists because it's part of our experience. But
well, this is something that's so important about our time in history and our ability to expand our worldview. Because what I find in my life, and that shows up in, try to model in my work, is the tendency to close down, the tendency to limit our view and understand just a partial story of things, not the whole story. And seeing the whole story of society is hard, because then we start to see how racism is tied in with everything, in our culture, and we start to see how we take for granted the earth, and climate change is a reflection of that mindset. When we really open up to the bigger story, there's it's devastating, and we have to be able to also feel that, because our body can feel that devastation and be opened by it, whereas our mind will just kind of shut down and say, I can't look that big, I can't open the scope that big. But as human beings, we do have the capacity to understand our role in the universe. And wholeness, I think we are a part of that universe in such an integral way that when we have moments of spiritual connection or insight, usually it's about feeling like we're not isolated, we're not alone. We have moments where it's like somebody comes into our life in a way that seems synchronistic, and we're like, how did they know I was going to be there? But it's because that we find that situation interesting, because it takes away this sense that we're just alone and isolated in the world, that we're all separate from each other and part of this independent timelines that occasionally meet if we make plans, but we're actually part of this integrated woven fabric that is constantly pulling us together into each other's lives. So seeing ourselves as part of that, I think, is a really sort of spiritual experience, but it can be described with this in the language of science as well.
yeah. Okay, so I'm really looking forward to diving in and letting you describe some of the language of science around that. But before we do that, since we kind of breezed over, I want to just let you explain a little bit of how you got to be in this beautiful merging of synchronicity, flow, and physics, and how you got to studying that. And I'll let you tell your story, and just kind of by way of introduction, let everybody know that Sky has a master's degree in physics, that he studied at San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley. He's also an incredible musician as well. So you just bring a beautiful, rich background, and as I explained earlier, your own spiritual practice. So tell us a little bit about how you came to be doing the work you're doing and write those books you did.
Well, I grew up being taught about spiritual practices from many different angles. One of my families, my parents, my mom and my stepdad, were devotees of Swami Satchidananda, who's a teacher from the East, from India. And he moved here and started traditions here. And so I learned early on about Bhagavad Gita and the Sutras of Patanjali and the Vedanta view that consciousness is first, that we are all conscious beings. And within that consciousness, there is the reality that we experience. But it's not, as a physicist might say, it's not matter that gives rise to people. It's actually consciousness that gives rise to matter, gives rise to people. So it's more subtle and in a sense holistic, because then the material world is all emerging from the awareness of the material world. There's something very non-physical about that. And non-physical and wholeness sort of go together, something that is not breakable into parts. So I had that tradition, but also on the other side of my family, there was a lot of scientific tradition. I went to school and had a coincidence where I had an injury with my hand, so I couldn't continue to play music in school and in Berkeley. And my girlfriend at the time, her father, accidentally convinced me to go into physics just by saying, every physicist I've ever known has been really talented, good problem solver. He was an engineer. So I heard that, and I was trying to impress him. And I thought, I'll just go into physics. So I sort of switched gears there and started doing physics and loved it. I actually got an F on my first test. I sort of they had to switch me into gear to understand exactly how to think differently, and but have it so much aligned with the exploration that I've been doing for many, many years of what is the nature of reality, because that's ultimately the question that's constantly kept me up at night and driven me to get out of bed in the morning. What is the nature of reality? And I've had some experiences, that I can point to where I could see that life is deeper than what meets the eye. And these are examples, you can call them, sometimes they're synchronicities. Sometimes it's seeing something differently and then finding out that it's true later, but you kind of know intuitively the way something works. And and I had this experience that my readers may have read about or seen that I talk about, meeting this person that I'd been friends with for 7 years. And while we were traveling, we were trying to meet in one place in Greece, and everything got derailed, and I had to go home through Paris and fly home. But while in Paris, I had one day, and I went to the Louvre Museum. Well, she got derailed as well because her friends invited her to go to Paris. And she almost said no because she was waiting to meet me, but she decided to forget about me and go to Paris. So she ends up in Paris at the Louvre, and I end up in Paris at the Louvre, and we met. And if you try to do that, you never make it work. But when synchronicity is happening, there's this way in which I looked at that and I said, how is it possible that we met by accident? And this, by the way, is my wife now. So this is not just a random person. This is someone who had been in my life. It's very important, a soulmate for me. And how is it that our lives got woven together? Well, the way that I can understand it is that what we think of as reality, what we think of as fixed reality, is not actually fixed. And anything that you haven't observed, just like a virtual reality, everything you're observing is what it is. But everything outside of that virtual reality space is just bits on a computer waiting to be decided upon. And so depending on what room I go into at the Louvre Museum, Dana can end up in one of those rooms based on the sort of adjustment of her history to match mine. And there's much more details to be worked out there in my work, but that's the basic idea, that history is flexible to our perception of it. When we make those connections, that's when the synchronicity kind of falls into place, and the meaningfulness falls into place.
This idea that I first encountered in your book, that histories are flexible, just literally blew my mind when I started to try to wrap around it, because what I really hear you saying is this, like, really our perception, or sort of naive perception, is that all this is going on outside of our view, that in the part of world that I can't see, that world is continuing to evolve, which seems just so obvious that it is. And what you're saying is, no, that's not, you don't think that's actually how it works.
Well, it's evolving, but what quantum mechanics tells us is that when things are not being observed directly, that they evolve into branches.
Okay.
So what's happening is the world around us that we're not observing is branching into a multiverse of possibilities. And so that's the flexibility, right? You're essentially, you have all these branches that you're choosing from in a way, although not consciously. You're not saying, I want that and that and that, but through the choices that we make, I try and show that there's a way that we can influence statistically which of those meaningful branches we do experience, so that there's a likelihood that an elevated likelihood that I'll meet Dana in one of the rooms versus just the random likelihood that is pretty low.
Okay.
So, and this is so important, because when we live in a world that is happening anyway, it's very disempowering, because we feel like we just have to guess what's going to happen next. We have to sort of shore up our defenses and figure out how to make our checkbook balance and have all the right plans. But when we live in a world that is actually unfolding dynamically and not determined in advance, even the past is not determined yet until we meet it, then that's much more of an empowering perspective that we need to be taking on, that our choices matter, because what's unfolding in the world hasn't even been determined yet.
Right. And so, I mean, the operative thing there is our choice, right? Like, all the power lies in the choice of that moment, correct?
Yeah, that's where our power lies.
Yeah.
In choice. And the question of, I think it's a really important question. How do we choose? This is not a simple question. I don't have an answer that, is for everybody. But I look at my life, and it comes down to, it can be expressed as simply as, do the choices we make open us to greater possibilities? Do they open our hearts or our minds to new ideas? Are we learning and growing? Are we healing? Or are we shutting down? And if you look at how humans and all creatures evolve, for a while we're expanding and learning and growing. And then slowly we sort of turn a point and we start to decide, this is how I feel. I already know who I'm going to vote for. I'm not going to do the research. I already know what I believe about climate change. I'm not going to really listen to somebody else's opinion. And we ossify. Our mindsets become fixed. And so it's counteracting that tendency to get fixed in place that keeps us not only youthful, but opens us up to possibilities on that tree of branches that we couldn't see with our minds. So that's how we get into more flow, experience more synchronicity, by being willing to keep the options in our mind open without closing down on a certain opinion or, this is the way life is. I'm going to cross my arms and sit back and, that's it.
Right. Because that's a really fundamentally different way of being in the world, of one where you're, as we're taught in kind of some of the meditative traditions, right, where we're learning to observe and to actively respond as opposed to react, right? There's this kind of, am I living the life as everything's just happening to me,
right?
Versus versus am I actually actively in co-creation with the universe? And what it sounds to me like you're saying is you're actually showing this model that you're presenting is describing the physics behind how we actually are in co-creation with the universe. Is that right?
Right. So it's a model that could describe that, and it allows space for that co-creation. It shows how we can calculate that co-creation. It doesn't prove that that's the way it's really happening, but that's the work that has to be done ongoing. It does propose, I published both in physics journals and my books, which are not physics. They touch on the physics from a layperson point of view. And there are experiments that are done that are consistent with the model of relationality. Relationality is kind of what we've been talking about, that in a virtual reality, you're walking into a house, but only the room that you're in is actually rendered for you relative to you. That's what the relationality means. Every measurement that you make is relative to you. And the rooms outside of those walls don't even exist yet. They exist on the computer's brain memory, like as possible rooms that could be rendered, but they're not rendered yet. So, and coming back to that point of, staying open in our minds, I'm really very much hopeful about the youth in our world, because young people come into the world with this open-mindedness. And I could say that my daughter, being 12, already knows so much about the way the world needs to operate in the future, based upon the way she feels, the way she thinks. She doesn't have the skills or the resources or the maturity to implement those things. But I think that we as elder people need to learn everything we can from the younger people, especially those who are quote unquote naive, and haven't been, what's the word, disenchanted by life, because we need the enchantment. We need to re-enchant ourselves. And I hope that my model of wholeness enchants the world within a scientific paradigm.
Yeah, it sure does for me in terms of bringing that sense of awe and wonder. So let's, so I absolutely think it will. So let's just dive in a little bit more of so how do we tie synchronicity to getting into flow and living this life that's more in flow, in practical terms, with the choices that we make that are rendered on the fly for us, as it were?
Well, when we have a situation in our lives that's unexpected, a lot of times we tend to shut down. I was on my way to my final exam at graduate school, and I was on the bus. I had a long bus ride every day, and the bus breaks down. So I'm thinking to myself, one, I don't even know how I'm going to get to school. Two, I've got to study, because my whole plan was to study on this long bus ride. And so my tendency is to panic, this can't be good. And in that moment, can I see this experience as a synchronicity? Not necessarily a good one that's trying to, help me pass my test, but one that's challenging me to grow into a deeper, more confident, more faithful person who can handle challenge. If that's the goal, then synchronicities abound all around us. And so I get off the bus just broken down, a tow truck comes, there's like 20 of us standing on the side of the road at 7 in the morning in the cold. And I'm reading my book, and then another bus comes along in 10 minutes. So, okay, we're fine. I've got time built in. And then I get on the bus and it's full, just people standing everywhere because it's two buses in one. I'm like, there's no way I'm going to get to sit down, so I can't study. But I just open up myself again. Like my mind is saying, give up, it's not worth it, you're screwed. But I move to the back of the bus, I sort of edge by people, and I get there, and there's a person with his backpack on the seat. And it's like, there's all these people standing, this person's taking up 2 seats. But he notices me and looks up and says, oh, do you want me to make some space for you? So, sort of greedily, I took the seat and I was like, yeah, I need that, thank you. So that's an example of how we continually can be faced with situations that make us want to shut down and develop the strength of heart and mind to expand our hearts and minds, to open and to change the thoughts from negative, I can't believe this happened to me again, or I can't believe I screwed up that way, or whatever it might be, to being receptive. Not necessarily positive. I'm not someone who thinks we need to affirm things, but part of the work I do is looking at the filters, these filters we have of life, that the way we talk to ourselves, the way we think. And it's really important, I think, not to bypass the negative talk, but to look at what are the beliefs I have. The belief I have that something always gets in the way. That might be a belief I have, something always gets in the way. And to then reframe those a little bit. And when we reframe those, we can start to experience more synchronicity. Because when we have that experience of something getting in the way, we might state it differently, like, when things get in the way, I adjust well. Or when things get in the way, something new emerges. So the reality is still there of this thing happening to me, but I have a new perception of how I relate to that. And it opens me up to seeing the synchronicities that can unfold. And from there, we experience more flow because we're open and adaptive to the world that we experience.
I love that, this open and adaptive to the world experience. And it, my experience of that is that it feels, when you're in flow, like the universe is working in your favor. And it's really, which is like why synchronicity brings such a state of awe to me. And I'll give my example. I think I told you this in an earlier conversation we had, but my example of this is I was looking to buy a camper and I found one and it was 6 hours away, so in order to view this camper that I wasn't sure I even wanted to buy, but in order to view it, I had to do a 6-hour drive to go see it, right? Then I decided, you know what, I just don't want to take my Saturday to go do that. And that same Saturday that I was planning to go look at the camper, went up for a run to my favorite trail, and I was in the parking lot of this campground. And as I'm getting in my car to go home, the exact camper that I was supposed to look at 6 hours away pulls into the parking lot. And this woman gets out to go use the restroom, and I flagged her down and said, hey, love your camper. Do you mind if I can see it? And sure enough, I got a little tour of the camper, so I didn't have to drive 6 hours. It's that kind of thing. It really feels like the universe is working in your favor. Now it could, without, I think without, right, there's an idea of, is that just chance, right? Did that just happen? Or is there something else going on, which is the essence of what you're saying, the synchronicity, right?
It's either psychological or it's physical. And my gamble early on was like, if it's physical, I want to understand. Maybe it's just psychological, but I've had enough experiences that does seem like there's something more and we need a better explanation. So all I'm trying to do is come up with a better explanation than just randomness. Right. Because I think that's valid. And if we have a better explanation, it doesn't trigger buttons of like, magic, unfounded magic, because as Isaac Asimov said, all science that's futuristic enough will look like magic. So, if we can turn this into something that's scientific but looks like magic now, then there's no reason to say it's to resist it as part of the scientific phenomena if we understand it a little better. And I want to emphasize that synchronicities are not always positive; they're neutral, and flow is not always like things are in our favor. Sometimes it's conspiring against us. And I think that this is something that's really important for our world right now. When we think about, is there a conspiracy to make the world worse, or to take over the world, or anything that we might be imagining about stuff outside of ourselves? I think the cosmos itself is conspiring to wake us up to our true nature, which is not mystical. It's this true self of like what I really feel and believe that's been sort of layered on top of by society. So how do I expose the real me who's childlike and playful and happy and joyous and also compassionate and understanding, willing to learn. And the universe is trying to get us back to that. And it does so through conspiring actions in synchronicities. And these can be negative. These can be, I've had plenty of times where I leave it to the last minute on an interview or an important call to check my internet. I know, you had this problem today where I leave it to the last minute and then I go to do it and the routers died for there's one day, the one day that it died, And so I don't see it as the universe is trying to help us. The universe is trying to help us in the long term to learn how to be more competent, whole people. And so sometimes it's going to break my router if that wakes me up to being more prepared and thinking more ahead as a person in general. It's just a coincidence, but it's helpful to me. Not helpful to get my internet working, but helpful to wake me up.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then I suspect, because what you're talking about is there's these energetic potentials that have not yet formed until we actually experience it. Could it also be that whatever energy that we're manifesting or putting out in that moment is drawing that outcome towards us?
Yeah, so I use these terms carefully. Like energy is very defined in physics; it's a certain thing. So everything I'm talking about is moving along these branches of the multiverse, which are really informational. Every single branch is its own cosmos, and so energy is conserved within each branch. That's the physics of reality is what it is inside each branch. But then there's these other branches, and so this is where the idea of information comes in. In the many worlds view of the cosmos, which is discovered or developed by Hugh Everett III back in the 50s. In this view, the world is always branching into possibilities. And they're not all actual worlds. It's my personal view. We don't have to think about there being other versions of ourselves out there. But what we're doing is there's this informational layout of possibility, this matrix or field of possibility. And we're not sending waves in space and time to each other for telepathy or figuring. I don't think it's that, because we've already tested for that. It doesn't exist. But we're choosing between these branches of possibility, which exist in sort of a more informational field of possibilities that we call the universal wave function, which is a controversial idea, but I'm just trying to give a layout of some of the possibilities.
Okay. So let's, I would love to go in a little bit to wholeness and the physics of wholeness, because it is so fundamental from certainly from the Buddhist point of view, for example, and as you were talking about David Bohm's view of the universe actually fundamentally whole, that consciousness is the underlying matter, right, comes from consciousness, not the other way around. And so I would love for you to talk a little bit about the physics of wholeness and why that's important.
Well, wholeness, we can start off understanding wholeness by understanding what I think is the opposite, which is reductionism. Or another way of saying that is the sense that we're all separate from each other. We're different pixels on a map of humanity, and we're all individual. And any connections there are made by us. It's like, I know you got this phrase from my book, how do we create something from everything? Well, the reductionist view that I'm right here, right now, and I'm not connected to anything else around me, is this idea that how do we create something from nothing? This is the fundamental worldview that I think we have. It's the Big Bang, right? Create something from the vacuum. And it's a really limiting perspective because it leads us to think that if I don't do something, I've got no value. If I don't do a bunch of activities in my day, then I've not accomplished anything. So meditation, where does that fit? I don't know. I've got no time for it. And instead, this view of how do I create something from everything is actually more in alignment with quantum mechanics, where you have this tree of all the possibilities. All the possibilities already exist in what I was calling this informational field, the wave function. You might call Hilbert space, I guess. Those possibilities all exist. And what we're doing when we measure something in the world is determining which one of those becomes real. So I'm creating something from everything. And so wholeness is about looking at all those possibilities, all the ways things could be. And it's not that anything is possible. I like to reframe that. People like to think that anything is possible. Well, not anything is possible, but a lot more is possible than your current worldview allows for, right? So if I'm going to get on the train, in an hour to go meet my father-in-law, and I think that I have to meet at a certain time, and I have to get on a certain train, and that's my limited worldview, and I get there and the train is delayed by an hour, I'm going to be stuck if I'm just stuck in that worldview. I'm not going to see all the different other possibilities of ways that this could unfold in my favor. And so I'm not going to open up my mind to the synchronicities that might emerge. So wholeness is about seeing a broader picture of what's possible within that multiverse of all the branches. And that's one way of looking at wholeness. That's sort of the scientific starting point for me.
All right. So in that model of wholeness, you really go into this beautiful discussion about the holograms. And I really found that to be very, really a different way of kind of understanding the universe, that from this sort of two-dimensional world, and how this holistic, and so I would love to, if we can, dive into holograms a little bit, because I feel like when you understand the holographic universe a little bit, it really helps, for me, visualize what you're talking about with wholeness.
Mm-hmm. So a hologram is like a photograph, where a photograph is a piece of paper with, I think, silver compound on it. When you shine light on it, it gets darker, so it gets exposed and it creates an image. That's a photograph. A hologram, you do the same thing, but you don't shine direct light on it from an object or from a lens, which is what we usually do with the camera. You put it in a dark room, you shine a laser bouncing off an object, and then you let that laser light fall directly on the film. So what you're doing is you're capturing the light as it exists in the world without focusing it through a lens. What a lens will do is it determines what perspective you're looking at the thing from. So wherever you place the lens, that's the perspective that you see. If you get rid of the lens and you create this hologram, what shows up on the film is just this unintelligible thing. But then when you magically shine a laser through it again, you see the object as if it was really there. So it encodes the physical reality that was there when you took the picture. And what's amazing about this is that now I haven't pre-programmed in the angle of view or the perspective that the hologram takes. So when I change my perspective and move around the hologram, I see all the different angles as if the thing is really there. It's as if a three-dimensional object is floating in space, but there's just nothing there. It's just an illusion. So this is important for just so many great aspects to this. First of all, if I'm looking at a hologram of somebody's face, and I look at it from the left side and you look at it from the right side, you're going to see something different than I see, right? Because we have different perspectives on the face. You're going to see the left side of the face and I'm going to see the right side, and it's going to have different features. We're looking at the same thing, same piece of film. We're disagreeing on what's there. So it illustrates that if the world has this kind of wholeness, it's able to provide different views of reality for different people. So there's a reason why we might disagree on what it means when this law passes, or when this thing happens in the news. We have different views, different backgrounds, different perspectives, different filters that are going to cause us to see things differently. When I come to my daughter and ask her to show me her homework from last night, my filter is I want to support her in her schoolwork. Her filter might be my dad doesn't trust me. The same situation, right? It's just about a piece of paper, but we're seeing it from very different angles and having different experiences. And if we can understand that and notice it, then that's where wholeness comes in. We sort of peel back those filters that we individually have to see what's the broader view that someone could have here, and open up our expanse. So the hologram also shows that, how is it possible that this film can show us not just one view, but all of the views, depending on how we look at it? Because that means what's showing up on the film is not fixed on the film itself. It's sort of encoded into it. That it's not actually just painted onto the film, because then if you moved your head, it would all stay the same. But because you move your head and it all moves, that means that every part of the film is able to show every part of the face that's in the film, right? The face that I'm seeing can show up anywhere in the film. So there's this immersive experience, or an all-in-one experience, where every point of every pixel on the film can show me any part of the face that I'm looking at. And that's very different from a screen on your computer, which is pixelated, where every part of the screen corresponds to a single pixel on the person's face.
Right.
So interrelationships of all the parts to create a whole is the essence of a hologram.
Are contained at every point in the hologram itself?
Yeah. So if I could cut out most of the hologram and just keep a little circle in the middle, I would block out, and maybe I kept your nose, but I wouldn't see your eyes. Too bad. Well, if it's a photograph, I'm out of luck. But if it's a hologram, if I want to see your eyes, I just move my head down like I'm looking through a window until I see your eyes. Because your eyes are actually also present in that little space that you cut out. So every point in the hologram actually has information about everything in space. And if the world is holographic, which we could talk about, that's what my research is essentially showing, that the rules of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory are the same equations as a hologram. Then if that's what describes the world, then there is a sense in which every part of the cosmos has every part of us in it. And we are this all-to-one relationship. And we started off talking about separateness. Well, right here, you can see there's a sense in which we are not separate at all. That we're coming from this interrelated holographic field, in a sense. I'm being sort of loose with the terms here, but there's not a separation between us, because I can look at any part of the field and any part of the film and see what I want to see. I can see you, I can see me.
Right. So just like DNA contains the information for the whole organism in it, that every point in this universe contains the information for the whole thing. Yeah, and DNA is a good example. It's not holographic in the literal sense, but it does have this all-in-one. Every piece of DNA in every cell of your body has the whole pattern for your DNA. And then the mathematical piece, which I think can be translated into something that's more what we call ontological, or like interesting for people who are just philosophers, or not just philosophers. I'm a philosopher too, but who are looking at the philosophy and not the science, is this idea that we have a frequency domain. And we live in the physical domain, but there's also a frequency domain, which is this domain of patterns, looking at holistic relationships between things. And this domain is really well known to people who study like graphic design, because Adobe Photoshop uses the frequency domain or the spectrum to make changes to photographs. Well, you can use the frequency domain to like carve out the edge of the frequency domain, and you blur the photograph as a whole, because you get rid of all the high frequency data. Then the photograph goes from being detailed to being very blurry, but you're affecting the whole thing at once. And in my view, there is a thing that we could call the frequency domain in actual reality, which is a representation of each of all of us in that domain, where we're not separate. We're interspersed and intermixed just the way the hologram is. Yeah, I would love to talk a little bit more about frequency domains if we could geek out about that, because when I was exploring those ideas in your book and how you were talking about how frequency domains are independent of time and space. Am I understanding that right?
So it's like the frequency domain. It's like there's just one.
You mean like the book, like one? It's like,
well, it's not like we each have a different frequency domain.
Okay.
You know, there is
one.
We live in one cosmos called space-time.
Okay.
There is another dual thing. It's called the dual version of that, which is the frequency domain. And for every dimension in space, there's a dimension in frequency. So there's 3 dimensions in space. There's 3 dimensions in frequency. There's also a dimension in time. We call it space-time. So that has its own frequency dimension too. So that's the whole picture of the cosmos in my view. And it's the relationship between what we call the space-time physical world and this information or frequency representation of it, which is really well known to physicists. I mean, this is not something that's unknown to physicists. It's my interpretation and my application of it that goes beyond the mainstream. But this frequency domain is an integral part of how physics unfolds, the relationship between these 2 domains.
And am I have this right? The Fourier transform is the relationship between those 2?
Yeah, and the Fourier transform is a way of decomposing a shape in physical space into patterns that make up that shape.
Okay.
So I could give you patterns being waves, like sine waves, just waveforms like that, of all different shapes and sizes, fast ones, slow ones, going up and down, left and right. And you can break up, and this is actually, if you've ever, I say this tongue in cheek, if you've ever looked at your phone to see an image, which everyone has, even right now when you're watching the screen, you're looking at data that's been converted from spatial data, which the camera took images from the lens into the data on its chip, converted it into the frequency domain using a Fourier transform. And then it's basically broken down into the relationships or the patterns between the data. And then any of the unnecessary data is removed. Because when you break it into patterns, there's a lot of noise. And that's why your face or my face is not super extremely sharp. There are glitches and there are ways in which there are patterns that are dropped. They're just thrown out because they're just not necessary and they take up a lot of space. So data compression uses the Fourier transform all the time. And then we convert it back to the spatial picture so that I can see you. But what I see is a much smaller file because we've thrown out a lot of the patterns that just don't contribute to my understanding of seeing you. Unnecessary data.
What's so special about the Fourier transform? How does that play into it?
Well, it's a beautiful, I would say it's the most important mathematical technique there is. And there's a lot of people who would agree with me. It shows up in music. I first learned about it in music as a musician because let's go into this for a second because this is really useful. In music, you have maybe a sound file of a song. Beethoven's Ode to Joy. It's like 10 minutes long or whatever it is. Da, 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 na, 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 na. And that's beautiful because it's an arrangement of notes in time. And it's time that makes it beautiful. It's the timing of all the notes. Well, you can convert that into the frequency domain. And it's no longer going to, you can't play it on the CD player anymore because its data is totally changed. But it's changed in a very precise way. So the data is actually equal. The file size is going to be the same. It's still, 100 megabytes or whatever it was. But the data is totally changed in its format. But what it's changed to is instead of going from beginning to end, like from time 0 to time 10 minutes, it goes from low frequency to high frequency. So instead of arranging things in time, you're arranging things in frequency. And then you can cut off the high frequencies and you might not even notice that because you can't even hear that because you're not a dog, right? You can't hear the high frequencies. So that's saving you some data right there. And then you convert it back into time format and you have the song again, but it's now a smaller file. So this is what we do with music all the time. This is how we make MP3 files if you ever listen to music on your phone. So MP3 uses this format. But what's really amazing about this, back to this, to the frequency part of this, you're in that frequency arrangement. There's no time there. you're representing a song. It's like a literal song that somebody wrote that we can hear and is beautiful. But there's no ordering in time to that music. It's ordered in a different way, but it's timeless. And it's a good, the information is there, but it's not explicit. And this comes back to David Bohm's idea that there's an explicit world where time ordering is clear that we live in, but there's an implicit world where the time ordering is hidden. And this is exactly what a Fourier transform does. It hides the time data, the time information. It's still there, but it's not explicit, it's implicit. And so we can't access it. So there's a form that we can write the world in which time and space are not accessible to us. And if time and space are not accessible to us, how would we describe you and me being, thousands of miles apart? We wouldn't. There's no time and space. So there's a sense in which we're completely interwoven and overlapping in this frequency domain. And these are the kinds of questions that I try to untangle from applying the mathematics and the physics, and then looking at what does this mean philosophically again, as human beings. How do we integrate these questions into our lives in new ways? It's a wonderful exploration.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful exploration. So like one of your recent papers just goes into this. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, give an example of how you would have looked at that and wanted?
Well, so the paper I wrote called Space-Time Paths as a Whole, and it shows that the equations of the path integral, and Richard Feynman developed the path integral, that his original form of the path integral is writable as a Fourier transform, or recursing, like repeating Fourier transform. And you can take from that some really profound understanding of what time, how we think of time, and how time can be actually abstracted a bit more to be holistic. And so the main outcome of this line of thinking is that time is not just a grain of sand falling through an hourglass. It's not a point on a map anymore, because we think about ourselves being in the present, right? I'm here, it's Friday afternoon at such and such time on such and such date. That's true, but that's the grain of sand. What comes out of this work is this notion that time actually exists as an extended whole. So going from past to present to future on a trajectory, I call this a path, from the physics terms. And so if time exists as a whole, then you start to ask, well, there can be a plot, right? Because plots unfold in time. If there's a journey from past to present to future, then there's a plot involved, or a story that's unfolding. And you can see this in the following example. If you look at the sun, you're seeing light that is 8 minutes old, because it was emitted 8 minutes ago, and it's 8 light minutes away. That's the distance, however many millions of miles. Well, when you try and go faster, close to the speed of light, time slows down. So if you're a spaceship going from space to Earth, like the Parker Solar Probe, which many people don't know about, the solar probe that's actually traveling around the sun right now. It's amazing. I love it.
Very cool. I didn't know that.
Well, they say we're kissing the sun because we're going within the outer layers of the sun.
Wow.
So this probe that took months to get to the sun was going pretty slow compared to the speed of light. Well, if it got closer to the speed of light, time would slow down, and space would get shorter. And if you go at the speed of light, you can't. So, but light goes at the speed of light. And what we understand from that is that there is no space and no time for the light that's traveling between the sun and the Earth. Well, if there's no space and no time, then what's the light doing? Traveling from there to here? And how far is it going? Well, none of those questions make any sense anymore. Right. And the beginning point and the end point are actually one thing. The emission of the light and the absorption of the light on the Earth is one thing. And Gilbert Lewis is a physicist and chemist who called this virtual contact. That we're actually in virtual contact with the sun, because there's no separate, because there's this interval that we call a null interval, a zero interval between here and there. Well, don't get too immersed in what that means. I've had to work to kind of untangle what can we really conclude from this. And what we can conclude is not that we can go to the speed of light, or not that we can go back in time or any of that stuff, but that time that path of light from the sun to the earth, that 8-minute interval, exists as a whole. And when you do something at the 6-minute mark, before the path as a whole is done, and you're intervening on that path with like a satellite or something like that, that path also exists as a whole. So you're changing history as a whole. You're changing the past history of that light particle to be on this other whole path versus the original whole path. And so if time exists as a whole, then this allows for this retroactive event determination of the path of the light to adjust what it thought it was going to be to what it is now. And this ties back to, talking about, a synchronicity where how the world unfolds. I forget the example. What example did I give earlier about the flexible histories?
Oh yeah, which one did you give?
This is the flexible histories.
Yeah, you're talking about your wife and meeting her at the Louvre and
Yeah, okay.
very beginning. Yeah.
How did she get there? Well, that's the flexible history, right? There's these multiple paths which all exist as a whole, and depending on what I choose, how I choose to interact or intersect with that, I will get one whole history or another whole history. And the fact that she was even in Paris sort of becomes true as part of that history at the end point when I meet her.
Yeah.
And that's how synchronicity can unfold, because it's the end point when we connect with somebody that determines the whole history for them to get there.
The choice, coming back to the choice, is actually like what we experience in that moment, what we observe.
Yeah.
It like all gets, is it all sort of getting encoded then is what's
Yeah,
true?
the encoded, the holographic representation encodes the whole path. So I just, this is speculative, right? Because I'm applying it to Dana now.
Yeah.
I don't know that she'd appreciate this. But when I think about her whole path of getting to Paris from Israel, which is where she was, that's encoded as a whole path in this holographic mathematics. Whereas if there's another path where she went to Greece, which we were planning to meet, that would be encoded as another whole path. And so there's these different entire paths, which depending on my choice to go to Paris can unfold one way, or if I didn't go to Paris, it could unfold a different way as a whole. So life and history are unfolding in this holistic way, and it allows us to make free will choices in our lives. And I can choose to go into this room at the Louvre, or I can choose to go to a cafe, or I can choose to go to the airport. And in any one of those choices, I don't have to worry, because there's a path in which Dana can get to that point also, holistically. And her whole path can lead her there as well.
That's the key, right? Because I mean, originally when I was listening to you, it was like, there's a little bit of a so what. So I really want to bring forth the like, what is the super aha about this?
Yeah.
And what you just said is like, because it's sort of implying this idea that you and Dana were destined to meet, that there's this destiny and that history is being flexible to make sure you meet. I mean, is that what you're saying?
That's right. That's right. And so if you're the kind of person that worries about, should I do this or should I do this? You don't need to think that way, because either way you choose, if you go right or left on the street, the cosmos can unfold in a way that's meaningful. It's going to be different in different cases, but it's going to be another apple on the tree. Every apple tastes good. So it's about letting go of the specific destination and opening up to a different way of choosing that isn't worried about regret or getting it wrong, but is open to, and this comes back to my main takeaway, which is when we open our mind and don't close around a specific interpretation of the world, become more receptive to each other's views and listen to each other's stories with an open mind and an open heart, then we become more able to experience, the world has more opportunities to bring us the situations which are going to be useful or beneficial to us or wholesome in this way.
I mean, this is so key. I really want to hammer this in because I think this is such a huge aha, because so many people, I mean, just what you said about regrets, about making the wrong choice. Of course, there's so much fear right now. You know, I'm talking to lots of clients who, you know, are, you know, around the vaccine, for example, you know, either choosing to get the vaccine, choosing not to get the vaccine, and very worried about the outcome of our world right now. You know, in a way that's really affecting their life and, pretty profound and sometimes really difficult, really suffering, a lot of suffering, right? A lot of people are suffering
Yes.
as a result of all of the stress and anxiety over what do I do now? How do I deal with, my neighbors who don't get the vaccine or pressure that people are giving me to and so, but underlying the fundamental aspect of what you're saying is there's this kind of, I want to almost call it basic goodness that is working towards a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm.
It's not to absolve somebody of don't matter what it doesn't matter what you do. It's all right. There's a
well, the positive outcome, often goes through disruption. So I see the positive outcome as being humanity understanding how to live in more harmony and not have systemic bias in racism. Humanity learning how to change the direction of climate change in our exploitation of the earth and our mindset. And these are mindset issues that make it hard. It's very hard to talk to somebody who has a different view from us, whether it's about the virus or about what they're purchasing at the store or whether they blocked us in at the parking lot or whatever. It all comes back to the way that we are as humans interpreting our world. So I do feel like the right conversation for me is about how is the world conspiring to help me grow? And how does this situation I'm in right now conspire to help me grow? Even if the person themselves seems like they're conspiring to make my life hard. This is looking at the broader view, seeing that we're all part of a cosmic whole. And for all part of this cosmic whole, then the answers to my questions are not going to come from the place I thought. The solution is not going to come from the person that I thought. I'm going to get a synchronicity, which is going to help me solve my problem in a new way. So if the neighbor won't get vaccinated, I'm going to find another way to feel secure in myself. Or if the neighbor is making me get vaccinated and I don't want to, I'm going to find a way to resolve that tension that works for me. But it has to do with, again, opening ourselves, not shutting down our mind around what's true and what's not true. And touching into, I think, our core goal in life, which is to become more who we came here to be. Are we the kind of people that can have difficult conversations and still love each other? And I think the closer we get to doing that, if all of us, it requires backing away from our opinions and our preconceptions about what's right and wrong and good and bad, and seeing that there's this hologram. We're seeing the same hologram, but we're disagreeing on what we see because we're taking different angles on it. That's the way it's supposed to work. It's conspiring to make us argue, to see how long it takes us to get down to the core self of who we are and see our common humanity and speak to each other from there. I think of it as how well do we listen with the desire to learn from each other?
It's really beautiful. And
so I'm very optimistic about that. I experienced synchronicities which led to before the pandemic. I picked up a book by accident with my daughter about a pandemic, and this is in the year before it. And so there's a sense in which this information was out there, like this is coming, humanity. This isn't about a group of people that created this to get you back. This is coming as a part of our growing process to learn about what it's like to be here on Earth. And if it's coming from this greater wholeness of the cosmos, it's here to help us grow. Climate change too, it's here to help us grow. So how can we dive into our own inner narrative and shift that narrative in a way that allows us to resolve some of these ingrained systemic ways of thinking that are causing us pain and suffering.
Yeah. So, and it's so, I really appreciate what you said about this looking outwards. Feels like so many people are caught in looking outward to fix the world, right? So you can be okay inside. Right. And you're arguing to actually go into our own beings, to look for the answers within, to look into our own wholeness and act from there, right?
Yeah, and that's what I teach in my workshops that I lead a workshop monthly that looks at the filters that we have in place, which limit that wholeness, tell us that this is the angle on the hologram I'm going to look at. I don't see any other angles because this is my filter. And when we can identify those filters, we start to have more freedom from them.
So by seeing that actually we're seeing a filter, we're seeing the world through a filter that frees us from the filter, and we can kind of step us out and take the other view and try to. And
it's like, can you imagine understanding someone's point of view who's really different from you? That moment of understanding, it's awe-inspiring, because you're like, oh, I get it. I get why they think that. And that's what I wish for all of us, to experience more of that.
Yeah, I so wish for that too. Well, I know it's been about an hour. I could talk to you for another 3, but I'm aware of the time. Yeah, I would absolutely love that. And I've just enjoyed this conversation so much. I really appreciate the work that you do. It's truly awe-inspiring. So thank you. Thank you for what you're doing and what you're contributing. And so you've got some upcoming workshops.
Yes, people can go to
tell people where to go.
physicsofwholeness.com is the website for the workshops. And then my general website is the synchronicityinstitute.com.
Great. Excellent. I'll put those links in the notes. I know you've got one coming up, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, October 3rd, but they're monthly. So whenever you watch this playback, it'll be each month in the first weekend of the month.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody who was listening or participating, and hope to see you all soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.